Hello and welcome to class. It's week 2 of DBA700 Foundations of Research Writing. I'm Dr. Greg Parsons and we're going to go over this week's assignments. So let's get into it here. First of all, this week we're going to go further into some of the processes and skills required in academic writing. The first week's discussion kind of allowed you to freeform on what you thought about it and how you interpreted the required readings. And this week we're actually going to get into what the experts say about academic writing and how it's done. But one thing everybody agrees upon is that it requires a certain set of skills in understanding the rules and conventions, what's expected in academic writing, but it also requires practice, because although we all can write to some degree of proficiency, academic writing has a certain set of expectations and standards that may not be a standard part of your particular writing practice. And so you may be a very good writer in another style, but if you haven't written in an academic style for scholarly publication, then this is going to be something that you need to learn and practice. Okay, but nothing works like repetition, and so I actually like this little saying here that write until it becomes as natural as breathing, and write until not writing makes you anxious. The idea being that there's should be no such thing as writer's block. There's only thinking block, and you write your way out of thinking block. So writing is not something to be avoided. Writing is something that you should use to develop your thinking on a particular subject, and that's what we'll be trying to work with beginning with this week's lessons. I've also included a new video in the Start Here section of the Blackboard class. It's down here. It's called the Academic Writing Overview, and so this is actually a good one to look at before getting into this particular week's class, because it kind of gives you an overview of the entire academic writing process, where this week we're going to be focusing primarily on structure and clarity, and then in subsequent weeks we'll be looking at some of the other issues such as argument and evidence and voice and transitions and synthesis. Okay, so this week we're going to be focusing on the beginning of organizing the structure for an academic writing assignment, but the academic writing overview will provide kind of a fuller featured look at the entire subject area. So this week we're going to have some writing some articles on writing. Okay, these are more or less instructional in the fact that they talk about, how you plan a paper, how you organize a paper, how you break it up into sections, how you put different ideas together. So primarily we're talking about when you sit down to write a paper, you just don't freeform it and start writing with the first sentence and end with the last sentence. That generally every paper should begin with an outline of what you plan to do. The outline then becomes the skeleton or the organization for the paper, and the sections of the outline then become the sections of the paper that the text actually goes into. So I'm a firm believer in structure for academic writing. When I read a paper, I want to see everything labeled as to what ideas are being presented in this particular section, what ideas are being presented in this section, how this subsection relates to this major section. So it should all be built upon kind of a logical progression of ideas arranged in an organized fashion. In the overview video that I put together, I went through an example showing how an article pulled out of a peer-reviewed journal was structured in a series of major and minor sections, each addressing a certain set of ideas, and then with a conclusion that kind of wrapped everything back up. Okay, so I think you'll find these articles useful because they start to provide us with a common vocabulary that we can talk about how it's supposed to be done. Now, for those of you who feel that this is, should have been learned in high school, I agree. And according to some of the discussions, you also agree that students graduate from high school and graduate from undergraduate without having good writing skills. Unfortunately, that follows them in through their entire life into all various forms of education. So we're trying to unbreak the bad habits, we're trying to break the bad habits and develop the right habits, and that starts out with understanding the structure for writing a paper. So the discussion assignment for this week is going to deal with planning, because you don't sit down at 11 o'clock on Sunday night when a paper is due and sit down and write a good, solid, quality academic paper. This should be planned out from the very beginning of the week when you start thinking about the particular topic that the paper is going to be on. So what I'd like for this discussion to involve is for you to look ahead, to take a look at some of these articles, and then to, in your discussion post, lay out how you plan to approach the week 2 paper. And I'll be getting into that in the next slide. But the idea is this will be a discussion about how you approach planning, how you segment your time, how much time you associate for researching, how much time you associate for drafting, how much time you're going to associate for revisions. Okay, so this is kind of like forcing you to think ahead how you're going to do this and telling your others in the class and myself, so what's your plan? When do you expect to have your outline done? When are you going to plan to go back into the library and look for additional information? Okay. So that's what this week's discussion is about. And again, you can base some of your information that you put into the discussion on the required reading articles. Okay, as you were doing in the first discussion, I expect to see those referenced because those are what the experts say. You may have your own opinions, but your opinions should begin to be formed around what the experts say rather than just what your personal experience is. That doesn't go very far in academic writing. We don't really want to hear what your opinion is unless it's based upon what you've heard or seen other people say, and then you reference what the source is. Was it from a peer-reviewed journal? Is it something that's actually been reviewed as being valid and reliable? Or is it something that is just somebody else's opinion? Okay, so that's the idea of the discussion on the first week of the week 2. The week 2 paper I want to spend a little time explaining because this may seem a little confusing. Now, you wrote your week 1 paper on a couple articles you selected from the library on human motivation. And let me just say right now, we are going to stick on the subject of human motivation throughout the entire class. So the goal here is to write a literature review, for each of you to write a literature review on human motivation. Okay, so all the articles that you've selected so far and all the articles that are provided here that you're supposed to get out of the library are all going to contribute to your eventual literature review. So it's a cumulative exercise that we'll be working on. With that said, the subject of this class is writing. It's not human motivation. So I would like the discussion to be involved in looking at how these papers are developed and how you start to think about a particular thesis for your paper, and not so much about what you think human motivation is. Again, we really don't care what your opinion of human motivation is, but we will start to care about what you think about what the experts have said about human motivation. So this paper is going to be a little bit longer. It's going to be 3 pages long, and that doesn't count the title page or the reference list. Those are separate. If you want to write an abstract, that's fine. If you don't want to write an abstract, it's not going to penalize you. However, I do want the paper to have an introduction. I want to have a paper with a body, with sections, and I want to have a conclusion, all clearly identified. So these 4 articles here are all about human motivation, written by different authors. Maslow is one of the grandfathers of the theories of human motivation with the hierarchy of needs. But other people have written about it extensively, and clearly it's an important subject regardless of whatever field you're in, whether you're in the health science field or whether you're in the business field or whatever. Human motivation, whether you're a manager or an employee, is an important aspect of why people do what they do. So it's important to know what it is. Now, the objective of this paper isn't to simply say, well, Maslow said this, and then go to another section and say Perrin said this, and then say Bertacci said this, and then he said this. The idea isn't simply to tell me what was in the articles, but it's to read the articles and begin to think of them as all contributing different perspectives on a particular subject. And as a doctoral student, what you have to be able to do is start to look for comparisons. Are they similar? Are they looking at things the same way? Are they looking at things differently? In which ways? Is there some sort of a development of ideas on human motivation represented in this stream of literature? Okay. If you think you need more to be able to write this 3-page paper, obviously go back to the library and find some more articles, because they're all going to contribute to your eventual literature review, which is going to have at least 20 to 25 references by the end of the class. So at this point, if you think, I can write 3 pages on this, but I think I need some more information, I'm going to go back to the library. That's fine. I think the more references you can include in your paper, the broader your perspective is, and the more you're exhibiting your researching skills. Okay, so that's the paper, and if this is kind of a question, you're not quite sure what you're doing, let me know in Ask Questions, or give me a text message, or put it in Ask Questions in the discussion. What I want to talk about now is what we'll be dealing with next week, but I'd like to use it as kind of a precursor to writing this next paper, and that's what we are going to use is called the Academic Writing Checklist, and you'll find the whole thing in the Week 3 Readings folder, and start here. Okay. And what it is a way of reviewing papers that identifies the key portions of those papers, in the same way that when I grade a paper, I'm looking for certain things that I think are supposed to be there, beyond simply, was this person, did they do a good job, did they write a quality paper? These are the things that make up a quality paper in academic writing. So one of the things that every academic paper should have is a thesis statement. Can you find the thesis statement? Can I find the thesis statement? Is it clearly laid out what the paper is supposed to be about? Does it say what the purpose of your paper is? Does it set the stage for the remainder of the paper? In other words, once I finish reading the thesis statement, do I kind of understand what's going to happen next? Okay. Does it clearly state what the writer's point of view is? That's what we want to know. In academic writing, we're not writing mysteries where we don't know what's going to happen. We want to know right up front what this paper is going to be about and how the writer is going to do it. So, consequently, the thesis statement should be in the beginning of the paper. If not the first sentence, somewhere clearly in the first paragraph. Okay? So I'm always looking for the thesis statement. Also, the first section of the paper should be the introduction. Now, APA formatting says you do not put a section heading called Introduction for the first part of the paper. I, personally, for my purposes, prefer that students put a section heading called Introduction. It'll be centered and it'll be bolded, because it reminds them that they have to write an introduction. I got too many papers that simply start writing with no idea about what the purpose is and don't follow the guidelines for an introduction. So the introduction should provide some general background, some broad background about the topic that the paper is about, and it should get the reader interested. The introduction, of course, should include the thesis statement, but also you should know how the writer intends to address the thesis statement. How are they going to prove their point or form their proposition? But then the thesis statement or the introduction has to connect to the rest of the paper. If you say you're going to do this in the introduction, then the rest of the paper should do that. Consequently, I suggest that people write the introduction after they've written the body of the paper so that they can actually write an accurate introduction. Also, each paper should have a conclusion, and this should, again, have a separate heading that says conclusion. It should be centered and bolded, and it should connect back to what the purpose of the paper was. So the conclusion is kind of saying, okay, remember back in the beginning I told you that this is what this paper was going to be about. And then what I did is I showed you through these series of steps that this is actually true, that what I said was true is proven with the evidence and argument that I've provided. Does it really close the paper in an effective way? And then, how is the paper organized? And this is what I was talking about a little earlier. Without a strong structure to the paper, it's very difficult for the reader to follow what the argument is that you're trying to make. So the question is the paper logically organized into separate sections with headings that represent major and minor points of the argument? Are the sections of the papers organized into a logical sequence that supports the thesis statement? And then what strategies are being used at the paragraph level to develop the ideas? Okay. So there's more to this checklist than we've seen right here. But what you will be doing is using this checklist to evaluate some papers along the way, some sort of sample papers. And then in the end of the class, around week 6, you'll be using the checklist to evaluate your classmates' papers. Not all of them. You'll get to choose 1 or 2 that you want to do. But the idea is that we improve our writing skill by having it reviewed. We don't write in a vacuum and think it's all done. Okay, that's the whole idea of the peer review process. The initial draft very rarely gets published in an initial draft form. Generally, it gets reviewed, sent back to the author for revision, sent back to the reviewers, sent back to the author, sent to the editor, sent back to the author. So many times it takes 4 or 5 revisions before the paper is actually accepted for publication. Even though the general idea might be accepted, we think this is a good idea in terms of getting the writing right and getting the arguments strong and getting the evidence presented correctly may take many go-arounds. So critical thinking is really the main issue in academic writing once we get beyond the particular style, where we want to have structure with headings and we want to have a certain type of language used and we want to have transitions used. But the process is really a vehicle to get a new idea out there. So you're going to use critical thinking by analyzing the literature. In this particular class, we're going to be analyzing literature on human motivation and how you're going to analyze, integrate, and synthesize what's been published into a new idea. You're going to build your ideas out of what others have already said. This is called deductive reasoning, and it's the basis for all academic writing, or nearly all academic writing, and certainly is the way that you'll have to write a dissertation. So basically, we're trying to get you started on the right path very early. Originality isn't like a light bulb goes off because, you know, you had this experience at work or something, and, you know, your military experience or whatever. The originality is going to come out of how you interpret the literature, what other people have published on a particular, in a particular field on a particular topic. And consequently, you've got to reference that, or it'll be called plagiarism. You got to say, well, where did this idea come from? So I would expect to see in your paper a reference list of all the references that you would use, all the ideas that you used in your paper. There are in-text references that shows where in the paper itself you quoted somebody or you paraphrased something from somebody else, and then there's the reference list at the end of the paper, which then documents which journals they came from, what volume, what issue, what page, and so on. So anybody could go back and say, okay, I want to see that what the writer said, this reference said, I want to see that if that's actually what they said, if that's what they meant by that. And also generally in academic writing, we try to avoid using direct quotes unless there's absolutely no better way to say it. Paraphrasing is generally a much more effective and used much better. If you read these articles, you won't see a lot of direct quotes. You'll see a lot of references, but you won't see a lot of direct quotes being used. So eventually, with practice, you should reach some level of enjoyment in your writing. That's the purpose. You got to like to do it because you're going to be doing a lot of it. So if you hated writing like Calvin did here, you know, you're going to have to overcome that. So Calvin and Hobbes are sitting here, and Calvin says, I used to hate writing assignments, now I enjoy them. I realize that the purpose of writing is to inflate weak ideas, obscure poor reasoning, and inhibit clarity. With a little practice, writing can be an intimidating and impenetrable fog. Want to see my book report? The title. The Dynamics of Interbeing and Monological Imperatives in Dick and Jane. A Study in Psychic Transrelational Gender Modes. Academia, here I come. Well, our goal is not to inflate weak ideas and obscure poor reasoning. One of the goals of academic writing is to clarify reasoning and to take complex ideas and make them easier to understand, to simplify complex ideas so that others can make some sense of them. So, if you have questions about this week's assignments, get in touch with me. Otherwise, I will see you in class. And until next time, goodbye and good luck.